Hi, this is Peggy again, and I'm in Schulenburg with Winfield. And we're going to tell a couple more stories about Aunt Augusta. Um, Aunt Augusta was one of uh, the Sterling kids. There was Uncle Chet, there was Aunt Stella, there was Charlie, and there was Marion, and there was Augusta. Augusta moved to Edinburgh in 1920, with the family, and she was still in high school. And so she finished high school in Edinburgh and became valedictorian of the class. And so Aunt Augusta was, not all the social person as an adult that we knew because she was always caregiving parents. She helped take care of her father, and then she took care of her mother. And at age 55, she was left by herself and going to work for the first time ever. And so her change of life was at age 55. Before that, when she lived with Grandma, her big things, they were gardeners. And oh my gosh, they had this spring garden that was just fabulously beautiful. And the same flowers came up in this big garden every year. And there were phlox and California poppies, always California poppies, larkspur. And they could flood irrigate the yard. So all of these plants, the ground would be flooded and the plants came up every year. They had Easter lilies, and oh my gosh, the Easter lilies every spring, they came up on the west side of the house, and they were kind of an understory because they were under the eaves, and any rainwater that we got would drip down on those beautiful Easter lilies. And for Easter, even if Easter was over, we would gather armloads of Easter lilies to take to church. And Aunt Augusta would be very careful to cut out the pistil in the middle of each flower and take any of the yellow out of the white flower because it had to be perfect for church. And when we rode to church, we were going in that Model T Ford car, and the roads were really bumpy. And so all that yellow would fly all over the lilies, so they had to come out before they were good enough for Aunt Augusta's flower arrangements.
No pollen.
No pollen, thank you. So the Easter lilies were armloads at the altar of the church, and this was a ritual. It was just absolutely gorgeous. So they were very generous with their flowers, and anyone who was sick that was a neighbor, Fanny was usually selected to run down the road and deliver these flowers to the neighbors. But anyway, so gardening was really important. That was inside the chicken yard fence. There was a fence around the house and around the garden to keep the chickens out. So the chickens were a big factor in our lives. And Aunt Augusta fed them, and she would clabber milk overnight. She had all this milk, and she would put it in crocks on the porch. And in the morning, they would be kind of solid. And she would mix that solid milk, that clabbered milk, into mash, and she would stir them together and take that out, feed the chickens. And then she would go and pull pigweed. And the pigweed would be a couple of feet tall. And she would wrap raffia type stuff around the bottom of it and hang it on the fence by the feeder. And the chickens would eat pigweed and eat that mash with the curdled milk. It was just really fascinating to watch how well all the animals were fed. She would gather the chickens and put them into the chicken coop at night, which was fenced on one side. It had a roof and a back wall to the north, two side walls, and the front of it was screened in so we could keep the foxes and coyotes and snakes out. And there were roosts built, and the chickens went in there every night. So she gathered her flock together and kept them safe, let them out at the coop in the morning, and then the hens would go to the laying house to go ahead and lay eggs. And then there was fried chicken. To have fried chicken, you had to have dead chicken. So she would wring the chicken's neck, and oh my gosh, that was just the way it was. Then you had to pluck the chicken. So she dropped that chicken in boiling water, and those, gosh, it smelled terrible. Those feathers smelled awful, and you'd pluck them really quick, and she would absolutely clean that bird perfectly. Take it in the kitchen, and she would cut it perfectly and ready for frying. And Scott told the story of, he said, we'd go over there and plow the fields, and Aunt Augusta would come to him and say, "Oh, come to dinner." And so at lunch, that noontime was dinner time. So Scott would come in to dinner, and he said, I never thought of all the work Aunt Augusta had to do to go ahead and fix a chicken dinner for me when I came over to plow her field. He said she had to kill the chicken, she had to pluck the chicken, she had to clean it, and then she had to fry it. He said, that's really a big deal just to have chicken. The other story I wanted to tell about was how faithful Aunt Augusta and Grandma were in going to church. And they had WSCS meetings. They had, Aunt Augusta was Sunday school, Sunday school, Sunday school. And because I was there so much, I had perfect attendance in Sunday school every Sunday. And they gave you this little church emblem, and every year you had perfect attendance, you got another link on the ladder. And I had this long ladder of perfect attendance. I've often thought, I wonder where that medal is. But coming home from church one day, Aunt Augusta saw a black cat ran across in front of the car, and she was very, very superstitious. She slammed on the brake of the car and said, "Well, whatever happened has already happened. I guess I need to go home." So she put on the gas, and we got home. All the cows were out. So her I knew it was absolutely right. She was just really, she would not go under a ladder for anything. So she had her idiosyncrasies that way, but she was always very, very generous with all the flowers for church, and she kept track of all the Sunday school money. Oh, I'm telling you, she would keep track of it to the penny. So church was a big thing in their lives. They didn't go to church during the week that I know of when I was a kid. I'm sure they did, in earlier life, but they were very, very faithful, both Grandma and Aunt Augusta. And I wanted to go ahead and just cover what happened with Aunt Augusta at the end of her life. She does have a stone at the Edinburgh Cemetery with her mother and with her father. But Aunt Augusta disappeared, and we, to this day, still do not know what happened to her. 1985, I think it was 85, Sonny got a call from Helen Money. At that time, Augusta lived with Helen Money in Edinburgh. And they had a nice little 2-bedroom house and garden. It was just really a sweet house for them. One car, and their lives were spent gardening and going to church. And anyway, Sonny got this call from Helen Money one day, and she said, I went to church this morning, and Augusta went for her walk, and she's not back. She said, Augusta is so, her ritual is that she walks this block, this block, this block, and she was walking 1 mile. A year before, Aunt Augusta had stomach surgery, and they had removed about half of her stomach. Luckily, there was no cancer in the tumor, but she had shrunk her body size a great deal. She had always walked a couple of miles, and so she was trying to work back into walking a mile. But she had gone for a walk, and she didn't come back. And we never found her. And there was a huge search. We had horseback, we had planes, we had people walking along canal banks. We had the school teachers went block to block. And I thought Aunt Augusta had had a stroke during her walk, and she had managed to crawl behind a shrub or something. So we did door-to-door searches. The police led it, and the day went by, the next day went by, and no Augusta. When we talked to the police the first time, Sonny talked to them, and they wouldn't go for a search because she needed to be gone a certain amount of time. I don't know, 24 hours, 36 hours, some measurement. And they didn't want to go search for her that soon. So I called KURV radio station, and I talked to Davis Rankin, and I said, Davis, my aunt has disappeared. It is so unlike her. Would you let people know in the community that we are looking for Augusta Sterling? She could have had a stroke. She could be ill. She was 82 years old. So he did that. I gave him the particulars, and he announced it on the radio, and anybody in the Methodist Church in Edinburgh knew who Augusta Sterling was. But we never found her, and Sonny was an investigator with McAllen PD, and he just couldn't believe it, and he stayed on top of the case. But to this day, if they find bones anywhere, I'm alerted to it, and I want to know, is it female and what age, but we have never found Aunt Augusta. So after she had been gone several years, about 3 years, we had a memorial for her at church. And when Mrs. Allen heard that we were going to have the memorial, she had the flower shop in Edinburgh, and she furnished flowers for everything at our church, always. And Mrs. Allen said, Peggy, do not have formal flowers for Aunt Augusta. All those armloads of lilies and flowers she brought to church, please do natural flowers for her. And so Fanny arranged the altar. She had blooming bougainvillea. She had all these blooming plants in the front of the church. It was gorgeous. And Bruce gave the highlights of Aunt Augusta. And that was funny to have Bruce do it, because Bruce was so combative with Aunt Augusta. It was kind of funny. So he gave his version, and it was just perfect. And Dorothy and Fanny and I sang Prayer Perfect. And so it was a Sterling memorial service. And I belonged to a club in McAllen, and the women all came. They said, "We've never known a memorial service like this before. We want to be there to see how you do it." Well, it was a regular memorial service. It was just that Aunt Augusta had been gone so long. So we're still looking for Aunt Augusta. One of the things that Aunt Augusta gave to me was this old trunk. And this trunk had been out in the barn, and it was really messed up. And we were driving through Boerne, Texas one day, and read a sign at the Chamber of Commerce that said, "I fix trunks." And so I called the lady and visited with her, and I told her that I had an old trunk and it was in great disrepair. And she said, "Bring it to me. I'll bring it back to life." So we did. We went home and got the trunk, and a few months later we took it to her. At that point, I told her the story about the trunk and what had happened to Aunt Augusta, that it was actually my grandmother's trunk and brought to Edinburgh, Texas from Kansas in 1920. And I said, "I don't know history beyond that. But anyway, I want you to look at this trunk, and Aunt Augusta has disappeared." And she said, "Oh." So Sonny told her the story about Aunt Augusta's disappearance and that we were looking for her and thinking of her. And that's why we wanted to do the trunk, to go ahead and help ourselves with the mourning process or whatever. And so she was very, very interested in that, and she said that she worked with a sheriff's department in West Texas because she saw things. And she was a seer of events, and she would solve cases for this sheriff's department, and they would always contact her where there was someone missing or someone murdered. So she went to work on that trunk, and she called and said that we went over fabric she had in her possession, and I selected a fabric, and she did a gorgeous job restoring that trunk. And she said, "One of the things that you do," it didn't have a top tray in the trunk, and the boards were there to hold one, so she built one. And she said, in this pocket, you go ahead and put the picture of the owner of the trunk." And so I had Grandma Sterling's picture there and Aunt Augusta's picture there, and that reminds me, I guess I need to add a picture there too, because the owner's picture needs to be in that tray. Right now I have a trunk full of quilts and clothing that has collected in my life, certain pieces. And so we learned a lot from her. She wrote a story about Aunt Augusta, where she could be, and her vision of where Augusta was. So Sonny and I started a search, and we came upon a well that was open, and we could look down, but there was nothing in it. And but we never found any real clue that would match her vision. So anyway, we had lots of adventures over this because it was something that was not solved, and we needed closure, and we really never got it. The closest closure we had was taking Dad to the cemetery and putting the stone at the cemetery for Aunt Augusta. So this woman who was so precise and ordered in her life had a very unusual ending.
So what's the speculation on what happened to her? What's the best speculation?
Okay, this is my theory.
Good.
A year before Aunt Augusta disappeared, Fanny's and Buddy's daughter-in-law disappeared, Mark's wife. And Aunt Augusta was obsessed with her disappearance. She knew that this pretty girl had been abducted and taken into Mexico into a slave trade. And that was Aunt Augusta's theory. She prayed for Kim every day, and Kim has never been found either. So there was a school down the street from Aunt Augusta, and she was very, very close to that because she became, at age 55, she became a school secretary and worked until she was, I think, 70 years old for the school district as a secretary of the school. And she was very protective of the children who walked to school along that street. And that was her path in her walk. And I think Aunt Augusta saw something, and she was so intolerant of abuse of any kind. If there was a child being abused, Aunt Augusta would have interfered. And I don't know if that's what happened, but in my mind, that could be something that did. And she was hit by a car, and they whisked her away, and they eliminated her from any of it. There were no cameras at that time on streets. So, but that's my theory. What's yours?
I have no theory. I just think somebody kidnapped her and hauled her away is all
Yeah.
I can know. Well, Peggy, thank you so much.
Sure.
I really appreciate this. You did another outstanding job.
Well, it's just memories, you know.
But they're good memories.
Yeah, they're my memories, and Aunt Augusta was very, very precious to us.
Okie dokie.